Good afternoon. Today I'd like to talk to you about the Republic, Book 6, and then about the Parmenides, where Plato offers up some of his own criticisms of his idea of the forms. So let's just recap some of the ideas that we've visited so far. And so first I just want to say, what is the relationship between justice, truth, and knowledge in the soul? And how is it that knowledge makes justice possible? We saw that the just person, the truly just and wise person, is getting their share of true realities. In other words, their reason-loving part is able to function well. It is reasoning. And as such, it is able to understand the relation of the forms to the form of the good. What is the form of the good? The form of the good is going to be ultimately that which everything is for. So the person with a well-ordered soul is going to be able to understand the true purposes and goals of everything, and will understand how to order the soul to those purposes. This means that she's going to understand the role and limits of each of the lower parts of the soul, but also what each of these parts needs. This means that if the reason-loving part is in control, if the reason-loving part is getting its due, it will also ensure that the other two parts of the soul get their due. And so then we have a well-ordered soul. Now I want to call your attention to a passage at 485 DE. And here Socrates notes, but in addition, when somebody's appetites are strongly inclined in one direction, we surely know that they become more weakly inclined in the others, just like a stream that has been partly diverted into another channel. And he continues, then when a person's desires flow toward learning and everything of that sort, they will be concerned, I imagine, with the pleasures that the soul experiences just by itself, and will be indifferent to those that come through the body, if indeed the person is not a counterfeit, but rather a true philosopher. A person like that will be temperate then, and in no way a lover of money. After all, money and the big expenditures that go along with it are sought for the sake of things that other people may take seriously, but that he does not. So again, the idea is that that when a person's desires flow towards learning and everything of that sort, they will be concerned, I imagine, with the pleasures the soul experiences just by itself, and will be indifferent to those that come through the body. Again, so that this single fund of desire is channeled in a particular direction, in the direction of reason, which is the activity of the soul by itself. The other two parts of the soul seem then to be dependent upon the having of a body in some sense. Certainly the appetitive part is like that. Perhaps it's not so clear if that's true of the honor-loving part. Now I want to talk to you a little bit about Plato's divided line. And this divided line is basically going to divide all of reality into the realm, on the one hand, of the appearances, which is the realm of the reality that we understand through our senses. And then on top of that is going to be the intelligible world, which is going to be the realm of forms. Okay, so when we talk about the visible world, at the very bottom of the visible world, and I'm going to try to put something up on Blackboard for you with regard to this so that you can follow along. At the very bottom of the visible world, we're going to have images, shadows, and reflections in water. So that is the most, that is where you have the least reality, because everything is shifting, and you're getting a sense of something, but it's not very substantial. Again, so think of it as when you see a shadow or you see a reflection on water, you see something, but you don't really know what it is. Or you may, but you're not getting the full picture. Next level up is going to be the originals of these images. These would be the individual plants and animals. And in the myth of the cave, that is where we are now in the sensible world, where all of the reality that we get through our senses is going to be, again, either those images or shadows, or actually the originals of these images, which are the individual plants, animals, and things in the world. Next, we move to the intelligible world. What we are talking about when we're talking about the intelligible world is primarily the realm of the forms, the space of the forms. These are the objects of thought. They are known by the mind. Now, there's two processes of reasoning that we have when we are working with the forms. The first is the process of hypotheses, the use of a hypothesis in arriving at a conclusion. So there you say, well, if X is a such and such, then it is going to have the following characteristics. Or if X is a such and such, in virtue of having those characteristics, Y is going to follow. So again, these are hypotheses. Now, even higher than the realm of hypotheses is the realm of dialectic. And here what we're going to be doing is looking at various options. What are the possibilities? And we start by saying, well, if we have, let's say, three possibilities, A or B or C. And what we do then, if A, what follows? Is there a contradiction? If B, what follows, right? And if C, what follows? So when we're doing dialectic, we are reasoning to first principles through this use of just looking at the universe of possibilities and seeing if we can reason through those possibilities to their consequences, see if we find contradictions and so forth. And that's how we reason to first principles. Now notice that when we're talking about dialectic, we are already making use of the hypotheses, because what we do is we have a universe of possibilities and we look at, well, let's assume A. What happens if we assume this hypothesis A? What follows from it, right? And then we look at what follows from B and what follows from C. Now, so those are the two reasoning processes that we have in the realm of the intelligible world, the realm of thought. Now, even higher than the forms, so in the intelligible world we have these forms, and even beyond the forms there's going to be a highest form, which is the form of the good. And Plato talks a lot about the form of the good. It's going to be very important. Now, with respect to the form of the good, Plato tells us at 509b that it is beyond even being. So he says, therefore you should also say that not only do the objects of knowledge owe their being known to the good, the objects of knowledge owe their being known to the good, but their existence and being are also due to it. Although the good is not being, but something yet beyond being, superior to it in rank and power. So somehow, everything owes its existence to the form of the good, or to the good. It is through the knowledge of the good that the being of all other things can be adequately grasped. And at 508b forward, that whole section, please read that carefully, we have this idea that we can think of the good in terms of an analogy with the sun. Just as the sun makes possible the viewing or the seeing of the objects in the world, so the form of the good makes intelligible all of the forms. It illumines the forms and makes knowledge possible. Furthermore, although the form of the good is the cause of knowledge and truth, so it is the ground of knowledge and truth, it is itself also an object of knowledge. But notice again, he says, objects of knowledge owe their being known to the good. And then again, the good is itself, however, an object of knowledge. And again, at 509c, he says, the good is not being, but superior to it in rank and power. It is beyond even being. So what does this mean? That everything is intelligible in terms of or through the form of the good. Whatever knowledge we possess, whatever true knowledge we possess it insofar as we can understand how it all works to the good, or how it's all for the good. I mean, that's, I think, the way that we can understand what's going on here. Why is the form of the good that through which everything is intelligible? And this idea, it's almost a kind of mystical idea, has really had an enormous influence in the history of Western philosophy. That again, the form of the good is somehow the cause of all of the forms, or the ground of the forms, and it's certainly the ground of the intelligibility of the forms. So somehow there has to be this drive the drive to knowledge is somehow also brought forward by this desire for something that is good. Now we need to look at some strange features of the forms that we have not spoken about before. And some of these are going to be spoken of in Republic Book 10, and this will be at around 597c. So it'd be good to read beginning at 596a forward until, let's say, 598a. So when you go through the material, go through all of that section in Republic Book 10, so that it'll put all of this in context. But it is here that Socrates tells us that the form of a bed is itself a bed, which is very strange. This is called the self-predication of the forms. So not only do the particulars, the sensible particulars, participate in the form of the bed, but the form of the bed is itself a bed, and so in virtue of what is it a bed, right? So this is going to lead to some puzzles. So note that at 497c, we get the following from Socrates. Now the god, either because he did not want to, or because it was somehow necessary for him not to make more than one that is in its nature a couch, made only the one that is what a couch itself is. Two or more of these have not been naturally developed by the god, and never will be naturally developed. Why is that? Because if he were to make only two, one would again come to light whose form they in turn would both possess, and it would be what a couch itself is, not two. That's right, says Glaucon. The god knew this, I suppose, and wishing to be the real maker of the real couch, and not just some particular maker of some particular couch, naturally developed the one that is in its nature unique. So again, there is where we get this issue of the self-predication of the forms. You have, he says, there's one form of the couch in virtue of which, if there's two of them, right, if there's two things that are a couch, there has to be one thing in virtue of which both of those are considered couches. So, and again, that form of a couch is itself a couch. Now we'll see that this is going to be a puzzle later on in the Parmenides. And notice that we've already spoken of before, that there are two kinds of predication. The is of identity, the chair is a chair, it is a chair, right? This is the is of identity, something is a chair. And then we can say the chair is green. This is the is of predication. So here we say X has the property F. When we're talking about the forms and the self-predication of the forms, what we're saying is that the form of a chair is itself a chair. The form of a bed is itself a bed. And this is going to lead, again, to some of the puzzles that are going to be developed in the Parmenides. Now, the Parmenides is a short dialogue, but it's very, very interesting. And we begin here with a conversation between Zeno, Socrates, and Parmenides. So this is a young Socrates that is being portrayed here. And Socrates is very cocky, and he's going to ask Zeno about his book. And we already talked about this passage earlier on when we were looking at Parmenides and his theories. And Socrates says, Zeno, what do you mean by this? If things are many, they must then be both like and unlike. But that is impossible because unlike things can't be like or like things unlike. So the idea here, Zeno had this argument that all things are, and insofar as they are like one another. But insofar as they are many, they must be unlike one another. But we have these two contradictory properties that we are ascribing to things if there are many things. Namely, we're saying that they're both like one another and that they're unlike one another. And so that therefore we think we arrive at a contradiction. If there are many things, this leads to a contradiction according to Zeno's argument. Now, Socrates is going to show that he can solve Zeno's paradox through his theory of the forms. And so at 129b, he says, if someone showed that the likes themselves came to be unlike, or the unlikes like, that, I think, would be a marvel. But if he shows that things that partake of both of these have both properties, there seems to me nothing strange about that, Zeno, not even if someone shows that all things are one by partaking of oneness, and that these same things are many by partaking also of a multitude. So the idea here is, look, we can make sense of an object participating in different forms. So the object itself is the same, and it can participate in different forms. And that is not going to be a contradiction. So he also talks about, look, I have many parts. I can talk about myself as, in some sense, as many in that sense, but I'm also one person. So in that way, I partake of the many and I partake of the one, but there's no contradiction in that. Because here we can think of this in some sense as the is of predication, right? There is an X that has a property F, but it itself is not that property F. It has that property F, and if it has that property F, it can also have a property G, without there being any kind of contradiction. So Socrates comes to rescue the day, to show Zeno that his argument is just false. If he had the mechanisms of the theory of the forms, he would see that there is, in fact, no contradiction here. So after Socrates introduces his theory of the forms, Parmenides comes on the scene and starts asking some questions and shows Socrates that he doesn't know, he's a young whippersnapper that really has not thought through his theory of the forms well enough, because there's going to be lots of puzzles concerning the forms. So remember now, the idea is, and he's going to introduce these issues, these problems with the idea of participation. Remember that the idea is that for each character that an object may have, so if we say X is G, there's going to be a form, phi, in virtue of which that individual can have that character. And this form has an independent ontological existence. As we said before, each form is what itself, so the form of a bed is itself a bed, right? So this is the issue of the self-predication of the forms. Again, there is a form itself, by itself, of the just, of the beautiful, and the good. And the form is separate from the things that participate in it. So this issue of the separateness of the forms is going to be a problem. And then again, remember that these forms are that through which the individual particulars acquire the characters that they have. And they do so through getting a share of them or participating in them. So now the issue is going to be, how do we make sense of this idea of participation? And Parmenides is going to introduce some possibilities and show that they all don't really make sense. Does each thing get a share of the form as a whole or as a part of it? Right? So how exactly does each thing get a share? If something is green, right? Some individual object in this world is green. Socrates would say, well, it is green in virtue of its participating in the form of greenness somehow. Now, is it getting a share of the green, of the form of green? And what does that mean? What does it mean to say that it's getting a share? And the idea, there's going to be two possibilities. If the form as a whole is in each thing, he says, quote, it will be at the same time as a whole in things that are many and separate, and thus it would be separate from itself. So in other words, if the green as a whole is in the green thing, then the form is somehow separate from itself. So, this is very strange. Then there's the second possibility, and that is if the form is like a sail covering many people. So maybe the form is like this, this wide expanse of greenness or wide expanse of manyness or something like that. And then each person or each individual object would only get a share of the form. So now what happens? We talk about the form of the equal, for instance. If the relationship of participation where you have the individuals somehow having a character in virtue of that participation in that form is more like the relationship of a sail. So suppose you have the form of the equal, and the form of the equal somehow covers all of the equal things, but all of the equal things only get a share or a part of, because it's like a sail, right? Like we're talking about like a big tarp. The part of the equal that each thing receives will be less than the equal itself, right? So there you have a problem as well. So either the form as a whole is in each thing, it seems, and then the form is separate. It's in there as a whole. The green is in there as a whole, or the equal is in there as a whole in the particular. And if that's the case, then the form seems to be in the things themselves and separate from itself. Or again, you have the sailboat analogy. The discussion of that problem, the one that we just spoke of, is at 131a. Now there's going to be another problem There's actually many problems that are being discussed here, but there's another problem that he's going to bring up, and this is the third man argument. This problem is going to be discussed at around 132a. And here we hear, what about the large itself and the other large things? If you look at them all in the same way with the mind's eye, again, won't some one large thing appear large, by which all these appear large? It seems so. So another form of largeness will make its appearance, which has emerged alongside largeness itself, and the things that partake of it, and in turn another over all these, by which all of them will be large. Each of your forms will no longer be one, but an unlimited multitude. So there's the argument in a nutshell. And the idea is this. If the large is itself large, then it's going to be, so the large is large, and then you have all these things in the sensible world that are large. In virtue of what do we understand that the largeness of the things in the sensible world is the same as the largeness of the form? There has to be some other form in which both the sensible particulars and the form of the large itself participate in order to be large. So part of the problem here is going to be that the forms are thought of as individuals, they are themselves individual particulars, although they're not sensible ones, right? But again, the form of a couch is itself a couch. The form of a bed is itself a bed. So he's thinking of these forms as if they're individual particulars, not sensible ones, but individual particulars, and yet at the same time demanding that they function in the way that we think of concepts as functioning. And if that's the case, then you get this necessity to find another form that's higher than all of the individuals, in virtue of which, right, all of the individuals have a common character. And if that's the case, then you get this infinite regress. Now, interestingly enough, Socrates is going to try to save the day by saying this to Parmenides. But Parmenides, maybe each of these forms is a thought and properly occurs only in minds. So he's trying to get out of this third man argument by saying, well, the forms maybe are something like thoughts. They're mental entities. And Parmenides is going to say, well, look, that's still not going to solve any problems because, again, we're talking about these thought entities, and somehow there's some similarity between the form, which is a thought entity, and the things in the world, the characteristics of things in the world that partake in them. And so what is that relationship? So if each form is a thought of something, and this is going to be at 132c, this is what Parmenides is going to argue. Isn't it of some one thing which that thought thinks is over all the instances, being some one character? So here the form is something that is thought, but is somehow over all of the instances, the particulars. So he asks this of Socrates, and Socrates says yes. And then Parmenides says, then won't this thing that is thought to be one, being always the same over all the instances, be a form? That too appears necessary, says Socrates. And what about this, said Parmenides? Given your claim that other things partake of forms, won't you necessarily think either that each thing is composed of thoughts and all things think, or that although they are thoughts, they are unthinking? So what does that mean? Again, the issue is that Socrates is suggesting that the forms are these mental entities. And if they are objects of thought, So what if the forms are something like thoughts? Is this going to solve the problem? No, it's actually going to make it worse. Why? Because somehow there's supposed to be some kind of a relationship between that thought, that thing that is thought, and the sensible particulars. What is that relationship? In what way are they similar? And it seems that if there is some kind of similarity, then all of these things, all of the sensible particulars that have those particular characters, whatever their characters are, must be somehow themselves thoughts, right? So that's what he means, where each thing is composed of thoughts, because each thing has a particular character. But what is that particular character if it's related to a form? Or that, again, although they are thoughts, they are unthinking. So that, in other words, although these characters, like the green in the thing, is something like a thought, it's unthinking. So in this way, Parmenides reduces Socrates' idea of the forms, his theory of the forms, to some kind of nonsense. Now, the fourth problem is what we would call the two-level paradoxes. And this is going to be discussed at 133e. So this is what Parmenides says. So it's already introduced earlier on, but I think that the heart of the argument is going to be here. Take as an example, said Parmenides, if one of us is somebody's master or somebody's slave, he is surely not a slave of master itself, of what a master is, nor is the master a master of slave itself, of what a slave is. On the contrary, being a human being, he is a master or slave of a human being. Mastery itself, on the other hand, is of what it is of slavery itself. And in the same way, slavery itself is slavery of mastery itself. Things in us do not have their power in relation to forms, nor do they have theirs in relation to us. But I repeat, forms are what they are of themselves and in relation to themselves, and things that belong to us are in the same way what they are in relation to themselves. Do you understand? So the idea is going to be, when you talk about the master-slave relationship, that is a relationship that occurs amongst individuals, amongst sensible, particular individuals. And it doesn't occur, that relationship doesn't occur in virtue of, the form. So the individual is not a slave of the form of master, right? So the question then is, what is the relationship between those characters of the sensible particulars and the forms themselves, especially since when you look at these relations, the quote-unquote power does not lie in a form that is independent, but lies in the individual itself that has that character, right? The individual itself that has that character is what stands in relation to another individual. So again, with the example of the master and the slave. And if that's the case, what are the forms, these independent ontological entities? What function do they have? How are they explaining anything at all? Because again, there seems to be these two levels, right? And on the one hand, you have what's going on in the level of the sensible particulars, and on the other hand, you have what's going on at the level of the forms. They're two different things, and how do we relate them? All of what's going on here are arguments that we should think about with regard to just maybe we should just get rid of the forms. Do we really need these independent ontological entities in order to make sense of what's going on? Now notice that at the end, at the end of the Parmenides, We're told, yet on the other hand, Socrates said Parmenides, if someone having an eye on all the difficulties we have just brought up and others of the same sort won't allow that there are forms for things and won't mark off a form for each one, he won't have anywhere to turn his thought, since he doesn't allow that for each thing there is a character that is always the same. In this way, he will destroy the power of dialectic entirely. But I think that you are only too well aware of that. So again, the issue is, how are we to think of these characters that many things can possess in common? How are we to think of, let's say, the idea of green, that many different particulars can be green, or the idea of one, that many different particulars can count as one thing, right? How are we to make sense of this notion that we can have these ideas? I mean, at this point, they're not thought of as concepts, and that's part of the problem. Later on, as we're going to see, given all of these problems, we're going to have Aristotle coming on the scene, and this is who we're turning to next. And he is going to say, we do not have forms existing in some ontologically independent space. The characters are always in the things. And with that, I conclude this video, and we'll start another one tomorrow. Thank you and good night.